1 Peter chapter 3, verses 1 through 8. Peter is addressing his audience, who he recognizes will be set apart because of their belief in Christ. He is telling them that they should live holy lives and that they should conduct themselves in a way so that others recognize that what they are doing is good and godly. So really what Peter's been talking about is make sure you got a good testimony. Make sure when people see you, they see somebody who's conducting themselves in a godly way. Peter told them that their conduct with the governing authorities and with their masters was important for them to uphold the proper testimony before others. But now in chapter 3, he makes it clear that it's also important how we conduct ourselves in our marriage relationships. In Ephesians 5:32, the Apostle Paul showed us that a godly relationship between a husband and wife should be a picture of Christ and the church. That's why it's so important for us to conduct ourselves in a godly manner within our marriages. Peter gives us some instructions for doing just that. I debated about taking a pause from Peter and just preaching a Palm Sunday message, because it is that time of year. And next week I plan to preach an Easter message instead of staying in Peter. But one of the things that we see when we look at Palm Sunday is Jesus coming into Jerusalem, lowly and riding upon a donkey. In fact, that was prophesied in the Old Testament that the King, the Messiah, would come in a humble, lowly way. Jesus' example of humility on Palm Sunday is so important for all of us in our lives. If we're going to submit to government like we saw last week, if we're going to submit to a master like we saw last week, we need to be humble. But if we're going to submit to one another within a marriage relationship, we need to be humble as well. There's a lot that could be said about marriages. We could do a whole series on that alone. When you look at Ephesians, it talks and it gives emphasis about the importance of the wife submitting to the husband. And there's the aspect of that leadership role of the husband. We'll look at that today as well. But before it really emphasizes the importance of the wife submitting to the husband, it says, submit. Both of you submit to each other. So there's mutual submission. Now there's an additional emphasis to the wives, but that doesn't mean that the husband doesn't also have to submit sometimes. The point is, we both have to be humble within a marriage. Both the husband and the wife need to be humble. That's the reason why it says submit to one another. Be humble before one another would be a paraphrase of that. Jesus, who has all the authority in the world, he's the creator of the world, rode in on Palm Sunday, humble and lowly. If Jesus can humble himself, should we humble ourselves? And remember that marriage being the picture of Christ in the church. If Christ is humble, I as a husband better be humble. So when you look at that, there might be an inclination to say, well, the husband is a picture of Christ and the wife is a picture of the church. Does the church also need to be humble? Well, of course. The church is to submit to Christ, who is humble. Just as the wife is to submit to the husband, who should be humble as well if he's going to be a true picture of Christ. So you look at all these things, and it really helps us to understand what a good marriage is supposed to look like. Marriages should be a beautiful picture of Christ in the church. So it is important that we conduct ourselves in a godly way within our marriages so that we have a good testimony before the world. Let's bow for a word of prayer. Dear Lord, I pray that you guide us as we look at this passage, as we look at your word, as we strive to live godly lives for your glory, Lord. Help us to humble ourselves. Help us to follow your beautiful example. Help us to learn what you expect from us and help us to live it out for your glory and for our love for each other. In Jesus' name, amen. Remember that Peter is telling us what to do, what is right in our conduct, so that people could see our good deeds and glorify God. And especially so people could see our good deeds and glorify God when others accused us of evil. In other words, make sure you're doing what's right and you're not doing what's wrong. So if somebody accuses you of evil, that their accusation isn't taken seriously. That's especially true for husbands and wives in a marriage, but there's an even greater challenge for a wife whose husband wasn't even a Christian. That was very common in the early church. By the way, it's still common today that there would be one spouse that's a Christian and the other spouse that isn't. Now, when you're choosing a marriage partner, if you're already a Christian, you should not marry an unbeliever. But oftentimes people become believers after they've gotten married. So what should you do if you're a believer and your spouse isn't a believer, especially if you're the wife? Yeah, and this is also important for the husband as well. I don't want to imply that. But the wife is referred to in this passage as the weaker vessel. Husbands have feelings. I don't want to minimize that. But I believe sometimes it's tough, or it's easier for the husband to tough it out. Now, it can get frustrating if you're the husband that's toughing it out. I don't want to minimize that. I don't want to minimize that at all. But I believe there's a reason why the wives are addressed here specifically. Verses 1 and 2. In the same way, you wives, be submissive to your own husbands. Remember, he's going back to the previous chapter, chapter 2, where they were to submit to government, slaves were to submit to their masters. You look at that whole situation with the slave having to submit to the master. That doesn't mean that slavery was okay, by the way. But what could they do in that situation? The Roman Empire was enforcing slavery. You look at Onesimus and Philemon. Onesimus is a runaway slave, and he comes back to Philemon. And there was reconciliation. And it was a wonderful picture of a Christian man and a Christian slave and reconciliation between them. And how they were to treat each other as brothers rather than as slaves. But put yourself in the Roman Empire as a slave. What's going to be easier? What's going to advance Christianity and the cause of Christ more? It's if you're submissive and respectful towards your master. If you show humility. Would have been a terrible situation to be in. But yet that was the reality of where they were at. I'm reminded of the book I read about the man who became a prisoner of war during World War II and was on the Bataan Death March. Christian man. And how he had to uphold his Christian testimony through that. I'm reminded of Corey and Betsy Ten Boom, who were prisoners in a German Nazi concentration camp, and how they had to uphold their Christian testimony, and how Betsy was such a shining light in doing that. How can you do that without God's power and grace in your life? It'd be so hard. And yet look at the testimony for the cause of Christ that came through those situations. And that's really where this wife would be at. Again, verses 1 and 2. In the same way, wives, be submissive to your own husbands, so that even if any of them are disobedient to the word, they may be won without a word by the behavior of their wives, as they observe your chaste and respectful behavior. As we consider marriages, many men want a pretty wife. If I were to poll the single men out here and ask them, would you rather have an ugly wife or a pretty wife? If they're honest, I think most of them would say a pretty wife. However, before I got married, my father-in-law sang a little ditty to me. And it was something to the effect, if you marry an ugly woman, you'll be a happy man for the rest of your life. And it was a cute little song. And
do my best.
so you look at that, and it was a cute, funny little song, but he was making a point. If you're going to marry an ugly woman, she better have some really good character, because if you're going to do that, there better be a lot of other assets that override that. And if all those other assets override that, yeah, you're probably going to be a happy man. And that's where this passage is going here. Verses 3 through 6. He says, and let your adornment be merely external. By the way, I want to pause for a moment. It doesn't mean you won't be a happy man if you marry a pretty wife. I laughed at his little ditty, and I married a pretty woman anyway. So I'm not implying that I married an ugly one. Okay? I want to get that straight. So I married a pretty woman anyway, but I was trying to be careful as I did. Because beauty can cloud judgment. But anyway, verses 3 through 6, it says, so talking to the wives again, let not your adornment be merely external. By the way, that word merely, I'm reading the New American Standard here. That was added for explanation. That wasn't part of the original. But I hope you'll understand where we're going with this and why the translator added that. But I did want to clarify that. But let your adornment be external. Or let not your adornment be external. Braiding the hair and wearing gold jewelry or putting on dresses. But let it be the hidden person of the heart, with the imperishable quality of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is precious in the sight of God. For in this way, in former times, the holy women also hoped in God, used to adorn themselves, being submissive to their own husbands. Thus Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord, and you have become her children, if you do what is right, without being frightened by any fear. When we talked about submission to government authorities, we talked about how we needed to obey God rather than men. So if we were asked to disobey God, we should not submit to that demand. The same would go here as well. With a wife and a husband, or even looking at Sarah as the wife with a husband relationship with Abraham, she called her husband Lord. And Basically, what that meant is she was calling him leader. She looked at Abraham and says, hey, you're the leader. And if we can obey God and obey our leaders, we should do that. Whether our leaders are the government, whether the leader is our master in a slave-master relationship, or your leader is your husband. If you can obey your leader, you should obey your leader. That's the point here. But we also need to address what is not being said. I mentioned that the New American added that word merely for explanation purposes. And when you're doing translation work, there's a certain amount of debate, how should it be translated? What was the proper way to translate it? What was it? One of the reasons they added that was probably because of what some of my thinking was when I was a kid. I remember reading this for one of the first times that I was reading through the Bible, and I read it, and, the women aren't supposed to plait. Well, what is plaiting? I think it's the version I read. Oh, braiding. Okay, so they're not supposed to braid their hair, they're not supposed to wear jewelry. And I read that, and it's like, okay. But I don't know too many girls that don't wear jewelry, and even some of the most conservative ones tend to braid their hair. And so as a kid, I was kind of a little frustrated at first. It's going to be a hard time for me to find a wife. Well, then as I got older, I read it, and I noticed it also says, the wearing of dresses, or wearing of clothes, or the wearing of garments, depending on your translation. Well, of course, women are supposed to wear garments. They're supposed to have clothes on. So it's not saying it was wrong to braid their hair. It wasn't saying it was wrong to wear clothes. So, okay, good. I could find a wife that had braids like Laura Ingalls Wilder's. Remember, Little House on the Prairie was popular when I was a kid. Probably about the time I was reading this for the first time, Little House on the Prairie was on. That's part of the reason it got my attention. I think Little House on the Prairie is 50 years old now. So, that kind of gives you an idea of my age. But anyway, I'm watching Little House on the Prairie, and was it wrong for Laura and Mary to braid their hair? All those things are running through my mind. Well, then I figured out, no, it's not. The focus should be on braiding your hair or making your hair fancy. And by the way, I started doing more research as I got older, and I found out that there were customs during that era where the hair could get really extravagant. They might put birds and flowers. It was like a floral arrangement almost. Something to be on display. They could get really fancy. And it's like, wow, it was work of art that they had focused on their hair. And when I first looked at that, it was like, okay, that's pretty extreme. And then social media started coming in more and more. All of a sudden, we got the social influencers, and a lot of the social influencers were those who were really focused on their look, showing how to do their makeup, and they would do these transformations. And it's like, okay, there's kind of some similarities here. If we came to the point that these things are focusing on is that the women ought to be concerned with their heart more than their hair and their clothes and their jewelry. That's really what it came down to. Focus more on the inside than the outside. That doesn't mean it's wrong to put on some jewelry. It's not wrong to put on some makeup. What's the focus? Where is your attention? Doesn't mean it's wrong to buy some nice clothes, but don't make that the main focus. We live in a culture where women are objectified by their appearance. That's not a new problem. Not a new problem. Putting birds and flowers in your hair. Talk about objectification of the appearance. It's not always just sexual when people are objectified by their appearance, although that is another issue. But Peter reminds us that husbands want more than just a pretty face. It's important that she be meek and quiet. Now that doesn't mean she can't make a sound or speak her mind. It's important that she be humble and striving for peace. That's what that phrase means, a meek and quiet spirit. She's humble and striving for peace. The word translated quiet means peaceable. What it really amounts to is most husbands want a kind wife, a peaceable wife, more than a high-maintenance woman. Many of you have heard that phrase. Yeah, she's a high-maintenance woman. And a lot of guys, when they hear that, they're like, I don't want that woman. That's a headache. That's what Peter's getting at. I want a woman that's easy to get along with, more than I want a high-maintenance woman. Peter's saying, be that kind of woman, be that kind of wife. The commentator Adam Clark described a meek and quiet spirit as a mind that will not give provocation to others, nor receive irritation by the provocation of others. I'd paraphrase that as to say, a wife that's easy to get along with. That might be expecting a lot from a wife, especially if her husband is unsaved. And it's not a surprise that an unsaved man would provoke her. We ought to pity a woman who's married to such a man, where little could be done to appease him. But by being meek and easy to get along with, being humble, she's got the most chance of having that situation work out. And by the way, those situations don't always work out. The hardness of your hearts, the Lord allow for that bill of divorcement, and that is a sad thing when something comes to that. But what about the husbands who are believers? They should not think that Sarah's respect for Abraham should cause husbands to be able to excuse their selfishness. Just because you're the leader doesn't mean you should lead in a selfish way. Remember, Jesus is King of Kings, Lord of Lords, and he humbled himself. He humbled himself so much that he came to earth to live as a man, and was in all points tempted as what we are. In other words, he can understand what it means to be human, to be us. If Jesus humbled himself so he could understand what it means to be us, should we as husbands humble ourselves to try to understand what it would be like to be a wife, to have to be under that leadership? Peter addresses this. And by the way, as I focus on this section, I don't want to minimize the fact that the husband is supposed to lead. Just as Christ is supposed to lead. We're supposed to be a picture of Christ in the church. But as we're leading, look to Christ as our example of humble leadership, of understanding leadership, of graceful leadership. Christ came filled with grace and truth. We as husbands ought to live with grace and truth as we live out our marriages for Christ's glory. So we come to verse 7, chapter 3 of 1 Peter. He says, you husbands likewise live with your wives in an understanding way, as with a weaker vessel, since she is a woman, and grant her honor as a fellow heir of the grace of life, so that your prayers not be hindered. If both husband or wife are believers in Jesus Christ, then they're fellow heirs in the kingdom. But regardless, even if one is saved and one isn't, they are all heirs to the grace that Jesus gives. Both saved and unsaved people alike are beneficiaries of the grace of Jesus. His salvation is available to whosoever will. So the grace of Jesus, the grace of life that comes through God, we ought to focus on that as we're focusing on being husbands. Knowing that Jesus offered his grace to us, and knowing that a godly marriage is supposed to be that picture of Christ in the church, husbands should extend their grace towards their wives, just as God has extended his grace towards us. But notice, verse 7 shows the way to extend that grace. And the way to extend that grace is for husbands to live with their wives in an understanding way. Live with your wives in an understanding way. We need to understand the struggles she's facing. We need to understand what she's going through. We need to understand what it would be like to be in her position where she's supposed to submit to your leadership, while also recognizing we're supposed to submit to each other. So if we're humble and godly and loving, we're going to look at her submission and her call to be submissive and say, how would I want to be treated? How would I feel if I were in her position? Husbands, likewise, live with your wives in an understanding way. Husbands, if you're not doing that, you're making things way rougher on your wife than you should. If you're going to understand her, she needs to have a voice to share her struggles. Notice that meek and quiet spirit. The idea of quiet is peaceable, not provoking, and being gracious when provoked. That's the idea there. But if you're going to understand her, she better be able to have a voice. She better be able to express her opinions, her desires, her fears, her concerns, her goals, her ideas. Remember, the wife is given as a helpmeet. I am really glad for my wife's opinion, her many opinions, because they saved me from a lot of misery. Because she sometimes has insight that I miss. And by understanding her, I'm able to become a better servant of the Lord Jesus Christ. And I'm able to become a better leader. Because I can lead better. When a king is ruling, should his advisors help him to lead better? What if he tells his advisors, I don't need to listen to you because I'm the king? Is that going to help him to lead? No, he's going to be a worse king if he does that. So I want to listen to my wife in an understanding way. I want her to have a voice, to share her struggles, to share her concerns, and then to show grace. Remember, Sarah is given as the example. Sarah from the Old Testament. Let's not forget who Sarah is. Abraham's wife. She's the one who got pregnant in her 90s. She was not shy about telling Abraham what she thought about getting pregnant at an old age. She laughed about it. Abraham got to hear her ideas. And she's given us an example. Let's not forget that. It's not always wrong for women to share their ideas, to share their struggles, to share their concerns. But she still recognized that Abraham was the leader. My wife is a lot like the Old Testament Sarah, because she tells me what she thinks, and as I listen and understand her concerns, she lets me lead. A quiet spirit doesn't mean she never says anything. It means she's easy to get along with, even though she's opinionated. Now, let's face the reality. All of us are hard to get along with at a certain point. I know I am. But overall, my wife is easy to get along with. And Grim, Nick's nodding. Mick, you miss Lori. I wish I'd have more time to get to know Lori even better. But one thing I knew about Lori, she'd tell you what she thought. But you know what? I got along good with Lori. There's a difference between saying what you think and having an opinion and not being able to get along with people. I understand why Mick misses Lori. It doesn't mean you can't have opinions. It means you should strive to be easy to get along with when you have those opinions. That's what Peter's emphasizing here. That's the example of Sarah. Notice as well, live with your wives in an understanding way as with a weaker vessel. The wife is referred to as the weaker vessel. And I really like that illustration. Imagine you have two pots on the shelf. One's cast iron, the other is glass. Which one are you going to be more careful with? You're going to be more careful with the glass one. That doesn't mean the glass one is less valuable or less important. In many ways, it means it's more important because you realize you need to take greater care with it. You see what he's saying to the husbands? You've got a responsibility here. You need to understand her. She's weaker. Think of Christ showing so much understanding towards the people he ministered to when he was here on earth. His grace, his love, his compassion, but yet his truth. He didn't back down from his leadership. But he was so gracious and understanding and kind. That doesn't mean that the glass bowl is less valuable or less important. In many ways, it means it's more important because you realize you need to take greater care with it. Husbands are to give special care to their wives, even if the wife treats you like the cast iron pot. Now, some guys kind of like that because we want to be thought of as tough. But my wife loves cast iron. She collects cast iron. You know what I realized? You still have to be careful with cast iron. You have to be there's certain things that you can't do with it, because otherwise it'll get all rusty, and then she's got to go through and get the rust off, and then she's got to put oil on it and bake it. There's a word for it, I can't even remember what it is now. Basically curing the cast iron. So wives, be careful with your cast iron pots. Don't think that just because he's not the weaker vessel that you should show love towards him. There's the emphasis that husbands are to love their wives. That doesn't mean the wives don't have to love their husbands too. I mean, both of those things. Just because he's a tough old cast iron pot doesn't mean you shouldn't be sensitive to his hurts. Yes, he might not be as sensitive as women are. But by the way, that's not a universal thing. That's just averages. On averages, women tend to be more sensitive to men. There's some men that are more sensitive than some women. Okay? We got a generalized average out there, so to speak. If your husband is sensitive, be sensitive towards him. Love him. Just like he's supposed to submit to your concerns to a certain extent. We're all supposed to be humble. We're all supposed to be humble like Christ. Follow his leadership. Show care for him. When both are showing such care for the other, that's when we find unity. I love verse 8 because it's such a beautiful summary. In fact, he says to sum it all up. I mean, he literally says, this is what I want you to get out of this message. Verse 8 says, to sum up, let all be harmonious, sympathetic, brotherly, kind-hearted, humble in spirit. Notice he says, let all, both the husband and wife be harmonious, be sympathetic. Notice it isn't just the husband that has to be sympathetic, and it isn't just the wife that has to be sympathetic. You both have to be. You both have to be brotherly, kind-hearted, and humble. That means putting others ahead of ourselves. It really involves applying the second command. The second greatest command, rather. To love your neighbor as yourself. And your spouse as your closest neighbor. For the wife, that means instead of trying to impress people with how beautiful you are and how expensive of clothes and jewelry you have, you need to focus on your heart, on being easy to get along with, on being peaceable and gentle. For the husband, instead of being selfish and demanding submission, you need to understand your wife's perspective and honor her. Notice what verse 7 says, and grant her honor as a fellow heir of the grace of life. The more understanding you are, the less difficult it will be for her to be easy to get along with. Let me say that again. The more understanding you are, the less difficult it will be for her to be easy to get along with. Jesus says, take my yoke upon you, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Don't make your wife's yoke hard and her burden heavy when it comes to getting along with you. Don't be the reason she's having trouble being easy to get along with. If you're going to be like Christ, you have to take that seriously. Notice what is said right at the end of verse 7. So that your prayers not be hindered. That's talking to the husbands there. Let's look at that whole verse again. You husbands likewise, this is verse 7. You husbands likewise, live with your wives in an understanding way, as with a weaker vessel, since she is a woman, and grant her honor as a fellow heir of the grace of life, so that your prayers may not be hindered. Think of that picture of Christ in the church. If husbands do not listen to their wives to understand their wife's perspective and their wife's needs and desires, why should God listen to our prayers when we bring our concerns and our desires to God? When we bring our burdens to Him? What it really comes down to, what Peter's really saying there, is husbands, treat your wives the way you want God to treat you. And if you don't, you can expect God to treat you as badly as you treat your wife. If you're not listening to your wife to understand her, if you don't care about her opinions and her thoughts, why should God care about your prayers? That's a pretty serious challenge to the husbands. No wonder so many marriages are in trouble. When husbands don't recognize and wives don't recognize how we're supposed to be living out the picture of Christ in the church. This passage truly is a guide for marriage. Again, verse 8, to sum up, let all be harmonious, sympathetic, brotherly, kind-hearted, and humble in spirit. But it's also a reminder of how we should submit to Christ, while also realizing how gracious, kind, and understanding He is. Let's live out our marriages in a way that presents that picture of Christ in a beautiful way. Let's not destroy our testimony by messing up how we live out our marriages. Verse 8 again. Let all be harmonious, sympathetic, brotherly, kind-hearted, and humble in spirit. I'm going to give you a few moments for reflection. For those of you who are married, if you recognize that there's some things that you need to change, talk to the Lord about it, and then go before your spouse and say, hey, I'm sorry, I need to change this. Please be gracious and help me to change. If you're not married, perhaps marriage is in your future. Pray that God would guide you to live in a godly way within your marriage so that you can have a harmonious marriage and you can have a beautiful picture. Some of you may never be married again or may never be married at all. Pray that you be able to share hope for those who are and are struggling. Not just in their marriages, but in their relationship with Christ. What a beautiful picture of how things ought to be, both with Christ and with your spouse. I'll give you just a few moments to reflect, and then I'm going to ask Mick if he would close us with a word of prayer.